Now I request Sri V. N. Shivashankar, Senior Vice President SICI, to deliver the formal welcome address.
Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, President and Senior Fellow, Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi. Welcome, sir. Dr. C. Rangarajan, Chairman, Madras School of Economics. Dr. Bhanumurthy, Director, Madras School of Economics. Friends. On behalf of the Southern India Chamber of Commerce, it's my immense pleasure to welcome all of you for the Dr. Raja Chelliah Memorial Lecture. In this series of lectures, we have been privileged to hear to several experts in this field, and sharing the stage with us today is Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, who has, we should definitely thank him for having invested his time and making sure he's available here. Dr. Rangarajan and the Madras School of Economics have always been pillars of support for the lecture series, and I also thank Dr. Bhanumurthy for providing us with the support. The topic for today's discussion, I'm sure the speaker will be able to delve more deep into it, but this is something which is of great importance, not only in India, but even globally. The challenge between how growth is going to be achieved vis-a-vis how climate change is going to take place is something which every country is really grappling. Efforts are being practiced globally to limit the surface temperature rise. Now we are seeing some new changes which are being proposed by the new US government. So we need to see how all this is going to pan out, how this is going to affect economic growth, how this is going to affect economic development. Coal continues to play a crucial role in meeting India's development and energy needs for at least for the next few decades. However, if India progresses to achieve the high human development index level similar to most developed countries by 2047, by working to achieve its net zero goal by 2070, then all of this needs to undergo fundamental changes. India is also strategically investing in diverse energy sources, including biofuel production, increasing its gas share, and targeting hydrogen production by 2030 to ensure a smooth transition. But considering that we have a growing energy need and we also have to make sure about the industrial development and progress, this needs to be balanced. The geographical advantage which we have in terms of the availability of sun, this is a key focus area for India, so that it can generate a maximum fuels. The government's policies towards solar, wind, green hydrogen, electric vehicles, and battery energy storage systems have also incentivized a lot of companies to speed up the progress in this sector. So before I conclude a few words about the Southern India Chamber of Commerce, SICI is a 115-year-old Chamber of Commerce based out of Chennai, having operations across all the 4 southern states. Formed under the inspiration of Mahatma Gandhi, our role is to function as a bridge between the government and various stakeholders. So the relevance of a Chamber of Commerce today is increasingly felt because the government needs the stakeholders' voice to be heard collectively. So our role is to work with the relevant stakeholders, be it industries, be it education institutes, be it students, be it other bodies, and present a unified view to the government and make sure the policies and programs of the government, the implementation, all of this can also be passed on to the relevant stakeholders. SICI has more than effective 25 effective committees, including EV, defense, startups, technology, and we work closely with a few government departments in all of this. I thank all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for setting the tone of today's lecture very nicely. Now I request our students to present saplings to the dignitaries present in the dais. Starting with our speaker today, Dr. Laveesh Bhandari. Ms. Gayatri will be presenting the sapling to him. Next, Ms. Amrita will be presenting the sapling to our chairman, Dr. C. Rangarajan. Now, Ms. Tanya will be presenting the sapling to Mrs. Sita Chelliah. Thank you, students. Now I request Ms. Harshini, an MA QF first year student, to read out a brief introduction about Dr. Raja Chelliah.
Good evening, respected dignitaries, faculties, and of course, my dear friends. It's wonderful to see you all here, and welcome to Dr. Raja J. Chelliah's memorial lecture. So Dr. Chelliah was someone who wore many hats. He was a teacher of economics, a fiscal policy maker, an institution builder, and a mentor. The most prestigious Padma Vibhushan was conferred on him by the Government of India in the year 2007. Born in 1922, he obtained his bachelor's and master's degree in economics from the University of Madras. After a few years of teaching at the Madras Christian College, he won the Fulbright Smith-Mundt Scholarship and did his PhD in the University of Pittsburgh. After serving National Council of Applied Economic Research, the University of Rajasthan, and Osmania University, he was invited to join the staff of the IMF in the Fiscal Affairs Department. He was the chief of Fiscal Analysis Division during the year 1970 to 75. Dr. Chelliah came back from the IMF in the year 1975 with a view to finally settle down in India and rebuild India's fiscal system. Dr. Chelliah has been remembered as the chief architect of the tax reforms initiated by the Government of India when the country embarked on its liberalization journey in 1991. Through his work in the area of fiscal federalism, as well as his research on development issues, poverty eradication, Dr. Chelliah has made invaluable contribution to the Indian economic reforms and has left an indelible impression on the present rapidly globalizing economy of India. Introduction of VAT in the case of indirect taxes owes much to Dr. Chelliah's efforts. He built both National Institute of Public Finance and Policy at New Delhi and, of course, Madras School of Economics in Chennai. He served as an honorary consultant to Ministry of Finance between 1975 to 77, a member of Planning Commission and 9th Finance Commission during 1985 to 1990, the chairman of Tax Reforms Committee and fiscal advisor to Ministry of Finance, and so on. He passed away in the year 2009. His publications include Political Economy of Poverty Eradication in India, an essay on fiscal reforms, Eco-Taxes on Polluting Inputs and Outputs, reports on India's tax reforms, income poverty and beyond, towards sustainable growth, an essay in fiscal and financial sector reforms in India. I can only say that the session ahead promises enriching information. Can't wait to hear what the speaker is going to contribute. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harshini. It is always our pleasure to have Mrs. Sita Chelliah among us. So now I request our director, Dr. Inan Bhanumurthy, to felicitate her.
Sir, madam.
We are extremely delighted to have Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, President and Senior Fellow, the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi, as today's distinguished speaker. So now I request our Director, Dr. N.R. Bhanumurthy, to introduce today's speaker.
Dr. C. Rangarajan, Chairman, Madras School of Economics, Mr. Sita Chelliah, members of Dr. Raja Chelliah. We have the daughter Malika, and I'm hoping to see Mr. Samuel also soon. And Speaker of the day, Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, SICI representatives, Mr. Shivashankar and Mr. Suresh, faculty members of Madras School of Economics, students and other dignitaries who are being part of this lecture. In fact, I think other than Dr. Rangarajan, I think I'm one of the few people who benefited from both the institutions which Dr. Chelliah has instituted. Like I was there in NIPFP for almost 15 years. Now I'm here at Madras School of Economics, so I'm one of the few beneficiaries who benefited from Dr. Chelliah's leadership as an institutional builder. So I'm very happy to be part of this, and it's also my privilege to introduce my good friend Laveesh. Those who look at the public policy, I think Laveesh is not a new person. He's been in this field for a long time. And it's an honor that we have you for this Chelliah Memorial Lecture this year. Laveesh is currently the President and Senior Fellow at Center for Social and Economic Progress, New Delhi, erstwhile Brookings, India. A PhD from Boston University on International Corporate Alliances and Joint Ventures. Laveesh worked on a wide range of themes relevant for the public policy. Some of the themes include economic geography. Those who remember his work with Vivek Debroy, it made him on the front pages of newspapers. I think that was one of the major studies that is done with Vivek Debroy. And later he has done a lot of work on the district level. So he's one of the early people who worked on the districts. And I think that's still being referred by the later studies. The other themes like financial inclusion, and I think his book on So Many Years Lost is another important book, particularly when you talk about reforming central public sector enterprises. And his work on infrastructure and work on India-China free trade agreements, they're all really classics, and I think they have made a huge impact on the public policy. Currently, he is leading climate change and sustainability research at CSEP. His present work on environment is focusing on advising analytics companies and startups in that space, bringing out a weekly newsletter on pollution named Environment Employment. I think that is another very important contribution you have done. And your studies on Delhi pollution, although pollution has not come down, but I think these are all very relevant work that you have done. He's also producing a weekly environment newsletter named the Unearthed Bulletin. I'm told it has 40,000 circulation. I think that is another important work that you are doing. Apart from applied economic research, Dr. Bhandari has been an entrepreneur. Generally, economists are not known for being an entrepreneur. So I think he is one of the very rare persons. He built, seeded, and exited. I think that's very important. Exited from 3 companies in research, analytics, and digital domains, including a very famous one, Indicus Analytics, a leading economic research firm. Dr. Laveesh Bhandari is also recipient of prestigious Exim Bank Award for his thesis in international economics. He also taught at Boston University as well as IIT Delhi. He has been the managing editor of the Journal of Emerging Market Finance and worked as senior economist at National Council of Applied Economic Research, chief economist at Nielsen India, chief economist at Indicus Foundation, director at Indicus Analytics, consultant for almost all the UN agencies. When I looked at list, I think you have not left any UN agencies. And there are many state governments, especially state of Jharkhand and other places. He has done a lot of work. He has worked in various committees constituted by Government of India Reserve Bank of India, and as I said, many other states. So we are very glad that Laveesh has agreed to give this year's Dr. Raja Chelliah Memorial Lecture, and he's going to speak on the topic, the Fisc and India's energy transition, which Dr. Chelliah has referred to in many places in his previous work. I'm glad that you have chosen the topic, which is actually fitting to Dr. Chelliah's contribution to this area. Again, I welcome all of you, and I look forward to listening to Laveesh lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I request our beloved chairman, Dr. C. Rangarajan, to present a memento to Dr. Laveesh Bhandari. Now I request Sri V.N. Shivashankar, Senior Vice President SIKI, to present a shawl to Dr. Laveesh Bhandari. Now he is also requested to give the memento and shawl to Dr. C. Rangarajan.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Thank you all. Now it is the time we all are waiting for. I request to the speaker, Dr. Laveesh Bhandari, to deliver today's Dr. Raja Chelliah Memorial Lecture titled The Fisc and India's Energy Transition.
Thank you, Professor Bhanumurthy. That was an exceedingly kind introduction, and in fact, some of those things I'd forgotten about. So thank you so much. You've been Dr. Rangarajan, Professor Bhanumurthy, faculty members, Southern India Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Shankar, dear students of the Madras School of Economics and friends. I can't but first start off with, and I'm going to leave aside what I've written, thanking Dr. Rangarajan. There's something which is not documented because I've never spoken about it. I met Dr. Rangarajan only one or two times in the past, a couple of times, and both times it left a very, very deep impression on me. I won't describe those circumstances, but I will tell that over about 10 years while he was in Delhi, and I was starting to do my own research. Like Chelliah, I used to watch him very intently. And what I got from him was a whole range of insights, but more importantly, patience, a perseverance, a wisdom that unfortunately economists rarely have. So thank you very much, sir, for being there. Thank you, of course, for inviting me to deliver this year's Dr. Raja Chelliah Memorial Lecture. I look back at the reputations of all those who preceded me, and I'm both deeply humbled and honored. I had grown up as an economist, learning from their immense knowledge, perceptions, and insights. Dr. Raja Chelliah, of course, is an inspiration, a guiding light for many, and I am one among them. On the face of it, there are three things in common between me and him. One, like him, I returned to India after a PhD in the US. Like him, I started my career as a senior economist at NCAER. And like him, I maneuvered through many spaces, but towards the latter part of my career, I embraced the importance of environment and economic thought. Dr. Chelliah grappled with a serious challenge that India needs to address in his joint work with Paul Appasamy, U. Shankar, and Rita Pandey, titled Eco-Taxes and Polluting Inputs and Outputs. The study, whose foreword, by the way, was penned by Dr. Rangarajan, focused on pollution and not climate change. I presume, as I said, I didn't know Dr. Chelliah, but I presume that this was not because they did not consider climate change to be an important issue, but because they identified pollution as a greater priority at that time. 1.5 decades later, while pollution continues to be of concern to all of us, unfortunately, climate change has become a priority. The silver lining in this very dark cloud is that Dr. Chelliah's joint work on pollution deeply informs our work on climate change. The underlying causes are the same. Humanity's penchant for violence against nature. And let us not use any other words but that. And the solutions are also similar. The polluter needs to pay. On this, only the symptoms differ in that climate change has arguably a far larger consequences. But pollution has arguably localized impacts. Climate change has those at a national global scale. While pollution impacts human and animal health, climate change impacts all aspects of our lives and existence itself. While pollution can be addressed at the national, perhaps state, perhaps local level, climate change has to have a globally coordinated solution. Both are classic externality problems. They are broadly two ways to address these. And as all students of economics know, either non-price measures that include prohibitions of various types and price-related measures that include taxation in various forms. Dr. Chelliah's work has focused on price-based measures, and so has my work. That's my fourth thing in common I have with him. Not because non-price measures are unimportant, but because even price measures work best in a regime where non-price measures exist. The other way around, where price measures work best, where non-price measures exist, and the other way around. Dr. Chelliah was not just an expert working on public finance. I believe he was inherently an institutionalist, and some reference was already made for it by the by previous speakers. As I said, I did not know him or even meet him, but reading his works and about his life, it is quite evident that he thought deeply about practical matters of implementation, sustainability, accountability, and responsibility. Perhaps for that reason, in the above-mentioned work, the authors chose to work within the existing tax structure. They were able to, and institutions, as that provides the easiest way forward. More importantly, they were able to identify workable mechanisms within the constraints imposed by pre-existing institutions. Now, this is really difficult because it's very easy to dream up all kinds of solutions. Extremely difficult to think of solutions which will work within the frame which is around right now. I'm fascinated with the thinking that would have gone behind some of the most refreshing ideas on environmental taxation for India, even though they were penned some 1.5 decades back. I take one example. Today, there is a move towards instituting a carbon market in India. Though the details have not been fleshed out yet, it will involve entities trading carbon credits, or what Chelliah et al. Referred to as pollution permits. I have instinctively been very uncomfortable with this initiative, but not able to form a clean and coherent argument against it. But Chelliah et al. Identifies an institutional argument. They argue that there are too many legal and institutional hurdles for credible pollution permits to be a workable solution for India. In other words, the argument identifies both institutional feasibility and simplicity. Over the course of this talk, I will share some issues related to India's transition towards a greener, more nature-friendly economy. In a sense, I will be sharing my journey as someone who approached the issue from the perspective of an environmentalist, but the training of an economist. I will share with you many alternatives before India. Some of these are fairly complex. Others don't bother about institutional constraints. Yes, I will venture about the out of the frame laid by Dr. Chelliah. In all of this, I believe that environmental challenge before us can best be addressed via an economic solution. Though you will also find that there are no straightforward solutions, and I will keep on talking about every time I'll throw a solution, I'll also share with you why it's a difficult solution. Each solution has some challenges. Each will require a process of analysis and deliberation before it can be implemented. How better can I honor the memory of Dr. Chelliah than to share with his August gathering how India's environmental transition rests on its fiscal policies, and how the frame conceptualized by Dr. Chelliah and his colleagues many years back will continue to drive India's shift towards a cleaner, greener economy. So I'll just give a brief motivation on what the problem is. I've already mentioned this. I believe that humanity, and I'll mince no words here, I believe that humanity has been self-obsessed and deeply disrespectful of nature. Pollution, plastics, greenhouse gas emissions, groundwater exploitation, overuse of chemical fertilizers, even the misuse of antibiotics, industrial-scale agriculture, heartless livestock rearing, unhindered deep-sea fishing, indiscriminate forest cutting, etc., are all symptoms of a deep-rooted malaise that infects humanity in general. The way I see it, global warming is merely one symptom of this deeper problem. And falling biodiversity in the form of reduced wildlife, plant life, etc., another symptom. Cluttered oceans and rivers unable to sustain life in many stretches are also symptoms of that same underlying problem. But just as economic insights have enabled us to progress more rapidly towards GDP and income growth objectives, so can they help us correct our errors on the sustainability front. Hopefully, I will be able to throw some light on some of these issues throughout this lecture. But I also subscribe to the view that India has a shot at achieving developed country lifestyles in another 2.5 decades. Yes, unlike many other economists, I believe it's a really difficult but a doable objective, but it's an objective we shouldn't just let go of. We should, when we think of long-term solutions, that needs to be around that objective. Okay. So this is not going to be where I find a solution where growth will be compromised. We need to find solutions where both is possible. The real challenge for India is whether it can achieve both higher growth and a greener economy. So I'll now shift base a bit, and I'll talk about what exactly are fossil fuels and how important a role they play on India's fisc. Over the next few decades, like most other countries, India will go through a significant energy transition with a steady reduction in the share of fossil fuels in its energy portfolio. Fossil fuels account for a significant share of Indian government revenues, as I will show later, and therefore this energy transition will also impact government revenues and necessitate a simultaneous fiscal transition. So while we transition towards renewable energy and other forms of energies, we will also have to transition on the fiscal side. Historically, India has not been among the major consumers of fossil fuels, and this is largely due to its low per capita income. The transition from a low per capita income country is an important consideration for its economic policy and will require a sustained and high economic growth, and consequently, India's economic growth has to a significant extent till in the past been powered by imports of fossil fuels. Okay. It might in the future as well. At some time, among major economies, India's growth in renewable energy capacity has also been amongst the highest in recent years. So while we are consuming increasingly more and more fossil fuels, we are also succeeding in expanding on our renewable energy capacity. So it's both things happening simultaneously. Currently, the Indian governments at both the union and the state levels impose a multitude of taxes, cesses, duties, etc. on all fossil fuels. And students, I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you a bit, but I'm going to read out the different kinds of taxes that we have there. Non-tax revenues also happen to be significant and include royalties and domestic mining operations, and also dividends from public sector ownership of fossil fuel companies. Tax revenues from coal include those from GST, GST compensation cess, customs duty on coal imports, corporate taxes, etc. In the case of oil and natural gas, tax revenues include those from cess, customs duties, excise duties, national calamity duty, VAT imposed by state governments, corporate tax, GST on select petroleum products, and there are still a few which I'm not reading out. There are literally, well, not hundreds, but there are a very, very large number of different types of taxes that are imposed on them. And of course, for both of these, the non-tax revenues are very significant. Royalties are significant for, let's say, a lot of states which produce coal. Dividends are significant for public sector companies which are exceedingly profitable. The petroleum public sector companies are one of the largest dividend providers to the government of India. In 2019, the bulk of revenues from fossil fuels at both central and state level emanated from taxes. For central and state governments, combined tax revenues from fossil fuels were equivalent to 3.2% of India's GDP. Of this, 2.9% was coming in from taxes and 0.3% was coming in from non-tax revenues. Now, just to give you a comparison, in the same year, India's total expenditure on defense was half of that, 1.6% of your GDP. So fossil fuel revenues completely overwhelm a large part of our expenditures. It was more than 3 times the sum total of government health expenditures, comparable to the sum total of government's education expenditure. And that I mean by both central and states. Significant global literature categorizes this continued high government involvement on fossil fuel revenues as carbon entanglement. So essentially, this literature says that if you're going to get so much of your revenues from carbon, then you would not want to move out of carbon. They call it carbon entanglement. A lot of this literature essentially hails from that. But that literature doesn't really understand India. Because in India, while we are deeply entangled with carbon, we are also deeply dependent on imports of carbon. So while the government revenues are coming in from this, the governments also recognize the deep dependence we have on imports. So in fact, what we are seeing is that a lot of government focus on moving away from fossil fuels is coming in from a need to reduce our dependence on imports and need to increase our energy security. So carbon entanglement as a global phenomenon is not really, I believe, applicable as much to India. So how are we going to transition? In joint work that I conducted with Ashirwad Dwivedi, we identified the combined quantum of both tax and non-tax revenues, which I have just shared with you. We took the base energy scenarios developed by energy use scenarios developed by IEA, which talked about how much of different kinds of petroleum products, how much of coal would India be using in 2030 and 2040, with some amount of reforms and movement towards greater use of RE. So we took these numbers and if tax rates, and assuming that tax rates and coverage do not change that much, the revenues from this would obviously change over time. Now let me explain why they would change over time. So if everything else is the same, but government is putting in more efforts towards, let's say, renewable energy, right? So a use of coal may still grow, but the growth would be less because renewable energy is taking care of some of that. Similarly, if you're going to have EVs in a large scale, petroleum consumption overall will still grow, but it will grow at a lower rate, right? So essentially what's going to happen is, though on the aggregate total quantum numbers will increase, as a share of our GDP, the dependence of revenues from fossil fuels will go down. So essentially, if we have 3.2 percentage points of GDP equivalent revenues coming from fossil fuels, this will fall to about 1 percentage point in 20 years. So that means by 2040, now even less so, right? Now, if that is the case, where will this money come from? Because presumably we will still need resources for so many other, whether health, education, defense, and so on and so forth. So that essentially is the motivation for this particular talk. Where will this money come from, in a sense, right? I'll just talk a little bit about states. I've just talked about both center and states together right now. How will states be affected? So if the total revenues in 2019 were 3.2% of GDP in 2019. 2% were coming in from the central government, and 1.2 percentage points coming in from state governments. This will fall to 0.4%. So for state governments as a whole, in the aggregate, it will become fairly small. So for them, it's going to be a problem. But there is a more serious issue here. Many coal-producing states rely on fossil fuel revenues as they benefit from both coal-related royalties from mining and tax revenues from the sales of oil and natural gas. Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh obtain 22 to 23% of their total own revenues. They get revenues from also transferred from the central government and all, but of their own revenues, 22 to 23% of their revenues are coming in from just fossil fuels. Okay. Further, the states of Orissa, Bihar, Andhra, Rajasthan derive between 15 to 18% of their own revenues from fossil fuels. Even smaller special category states such as Assam obtain 10 to 15% of their own revenues from fossil fuels. Most states have a relatively higher dependence on oil than coal, but the percentage of own revenues generated by oil and natural gas varies from 17% in Andhra to 4.3% in Himachal Pradesh. Thankfully, for all the major industrial states in India, such as Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, receive roughly around 15% of their own revenues from oil and natural gas, and it's predominantly coming in from petroleum. And I'll talk about thankfully a bit later why I said that. In other words, there is somewhat higher dependence on fossil fuel revenues for states with a lower per capita income. Now, this is essentially because their tax base is very low. And as the fossil fuel revenues will fall over time, these states are going to be the worst hit. Which are these states? I'll repeat again. Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Orissa. Okay. Even Andhra to some extent. Bihar to a lesser extent. Tripura. So essentially you have those coming in towards the eastern part with lower tax base states, which are going to be impacted for the most. And as fossil fuel revenue, unfortunately, there's one more problem that these states are going to face. Most of these are not very rich in solar power resources. Most of solar power units are coming in towards the western sides of India. They're not coming here. Nor do they have great, apart from a few blocks here and there, great avenues for wind power. So not only is their power going to be impacted, their coal power plants will need to be shut down, but their revenues from fossil fuels is also going to go down. So there is a deep difference between the different states in India and how they are going to be impacted by this. Therefore, as India transitions to a low fossil fuel future, three major movements, and I'll just recap here, are imminent. First, fossil fuel revenues will become less important. Two, the center will be more impacted than the states in the aggregate. And three, states towards the east and with a lower per capita income will be severely impacted. There is another issue. While India heavily taxes petroleum products, sometimes more than Western countries, the real problem lies with coal, which is taxed in a very limited manner. Coal is primarily used by thermal power plants. It's also used by some industry, but thermal power plants happen to be the majority users of coal. And coal is primarily supplied by thermal power plants, supplied to thermal power plants. Now, what these thermal power plants are essentially owned by state governments. They are regulated by the state level regulator. Almost all of them are deeply in debt. Almost all of them are unable to price as per their costs. Now, the really interesting part is, it's not that these companies, these thermal power plants owned by discoms predominantly that are failing. Essentially, state level regulation is failing because state level regulator are supposed to price power on the basis of cost plus pricing. So if indeed you had cost plus pricing, then why do you need to have such losses? So not only are these discoms failing, the regulatory setup is failing. Okay. So I just needed to flag this because this is a very core, serious problem any kind of transition will need to grapple with. Next, I'll talk a little bit about tax revenues in general in India. tax revenues have since independence actually been growing fairly well. They grew almost linearly till about the early and mid 80s. At the time of independence, tax revenues total, center and state combined, used to be roughly around 6% of the GDP. By the mid 80s, they were about 16%. Then they went down after the reforms that happened for some time, because there was a lot of correction that was happening. And then in mid 2000, they went back up to about 16. And then they have since the mid 2000s, despite what many of us believe, the aggregate tax revenues has fluctuated between 16 and 18%. So for 20 years, we've had aggregate tax revenues fluctuating. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. Lately, they have again risen up, but they've crossed the 18% barrier, I'm told. But they're still roughly in that same band. Okay. Now, so this remains one of the most interesting unanswered questions in Indian economics. Despite significant tax reforms, including expanding coverage of services, the introduction of VAT, GST, digitization, etc., we don't see tax revenues go up. Okay. So let me refer to some of these a bit more. The introduction of GST is undoubtedly a very important event in India's history of taxation. But introduction has not been a single event. A multitude of changes have followed its introduction, including greater digitization, amnesty schemes, rate rationalizations, etc. Moreover, the introduction of e-invoicing and e-way bills for businesses and shipments above a minimum benchmark was also aimed at reducing evasion and avoidance. On the direct taxes front, the reduction of corporate tax rates, faceless assessment and appeals, Vivad se Vishwas and other such schemes, taxation of dividend distribution, appropriate taxation of foreign companies, were some of the measures, but not the only ones. Unfortunately, the combined effect of this, though not insignificant, has not been adequate. It has not been able to lift the tax to GDP ratio above the 16 to 18% band. Of course, the hope is that this may play out in the future. Nevertheless, it is evident that if we consider global experience, an increase in aggregate tax to GDP ratio is plausible. Why? Because if we look at the global tax to GDP ratios and map them against per capita incomes, we find that there is a fairly clear, clean relationship. Higher incomes mean higher per capita. Higher per capita incomes mean higher tax to GDP ratio. So given that, it's just a matter of time when we would expect, at least given from global experiences, some of this tax to GDP ratio to go up. But when we look at India's data, what do we see? We don't see this going up. What we do see is reforms occur. And then after that, it takes some time. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years. And this time is not predictable. Okay. So we can expect that tax to GDP ratio will go up. We don't know when this will happen. And because of this uncertainty, it becomes really important for us to actually try and find solution to the fossil fuel problem. Now, if this uncertainty wasn't there, then I did not have a problem. Then what I would have done is I would have just waited. As fossil fuel revenues go down, something else will come up, growth will happen, and automatically tax to GDP ratio will go up. But that doesn't work. We don't know how and when that will happen. So now we are back to where we started off from, which is we do need a solution to this problem. Okay. Now, when we look for a solution, we first need to address the problem better. So I've just said we need more money. Okay. But I'm going to try and also identify what do we need it, how do we try to identify these problems. What kind of a tax solution do we want? First, we need something which has greater capacity. It needs to be able to gain enough additional revenues. There is something like, let us say as an example, I'll give you a professions tax. It doesn't really have the capacity to be able to generate large revenue. So that's not your solution. The other thing that's really important is that you need to have continuity. What is continuity? That whatever the solution is, should ideally be able to last for many decades. Right? So for instance, a lot of people talk about carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are only there for 20, 30 years. Why? Because they're dependent on fossil fuel use. When fossil fuel use becomes negligible, carbon taxes will also become negligible. So they don't satisfy the continuity principle. The third one, which I've already mentioned, is the institutional aspect. What significant institutional changes might be required to have a new tax regime, right? For instance, if you need a constitutional amendment, then you know that it's going to take you a long time to do. Autonomy. Whether potential taxation solutions provide adequate flexibility and control to the state governments. For all its success, and the great things about GST, it has curtailed state governments' autonomy over their own revenues. Right? Now, given that, going forward, it would be important aspect for state governments to buy in on any change if autonomy is, so therefore autonomy also needs to be a major issue of consideration. And of course, you need to look at what is the impact on equity, growth, employment. That's another issue. And finally, since we are talking about the environment, what is the impact on environment? So there are many different criteria. I've identified 6 of these that you need to look at and that I will talk about a little bit as we go forward. It is evident that the union and state governments will need to work hand in hand to find cooperative solutions. Unfortunately, we do not see that to the extent required. There are 2 sets of issues. The first is the lack of effort by many state governments to generate their own revenues. And the second is the penchant of union governments to raise taxes but not share them. And I'll elaborate on both of these points a bit. Whether it is electricity prices or duties, property taxes instituted by ULBs but backed by state governments, or institution of different kinds of user charges, generally we have found that most state governments are very reluctant to imposing any additional tax obligation on the citizens. On the other hand, we also find that the union government, at least lately, and also in sporadic incidences in the past, resorts to cesses to gain extra revenues. Now, that's not the wisest of decisions from a fiscal federalism perspective, because cesses are not shared with the state governments. Cesses are only kept in with the union. So we need to look into both of these. You need responsibility at the level of the state as well as the level of the union. Both need to up their game. So this political economic challenge lies at the core of many issues delaying reform and progress. While state governments need to take greater initiative in generating their own revenues, the union needs to be more forthcoming in sharing. Conventional tax solutions. Now I'm going to start to talk about a little bit about some of these solutions. The question that arises, what kind of revenue options do we have? In 2 studies on additional tax revenues that I conducted with Rajat Verma, we looked at some of the likely candidates. So we first eliminated direct tax as a major additional revenue source for some reasons. First, greater taxes at the margin do not necessarily increase revenues, as our own past experience shows, and also the incentive to evade increases. On the corporate taxes, also, it's going to be difficult because for a country which is looking for greater corporate investments, you can't really tax you can't have raised those rates too high. There is a talk about expanding the tax base, and agriculture is generally talked about the most. I believe that also is not really a practical reason. Why? Because agriculture or rural demography is very different from urban. You have large families, interconnected households. Land records also tend to have multiple owners in them. And more importantly, in many parts of India, the cultivator and the owner have many relationships. So it's going to be very difficult to be able to disentangle all of this and to be able to identify exact or the right kind of tax to put up. So so therefore we eliminated this at the major one. Among the major indirect taxes, of course, customs tariffs have increased somewhat, and all of you are economic students, you can't really increase customs tariffs too much, because if you increase them too much, imports go down and customs tariffs and customs don't need much. Okay, and of course, there's all of this uncertainty that is happening right now. So if we are interested in continuity, that also does not work. That leaves us with GST. Now, GST is obviously this amazingly complex thing which many people talk about, but the fact is that despite all its challenges, despite everything, it is working amazingly well, at least much better than I thought it ever could. Now, is it possible for us to expand the GST base or increase its rate and then gain revenues? At least on pure numbers front, yes. I will talk about that a bit later. However, institutionally, there will be issues. I don't expect state governments to be able to come up to a consensus with the union government on how to move forward on GST. We're already finding lots of problems, a lot of time being taken in coming through agreements at the GST Council. There is another class of taxes that I'd like to mention, which initially I got very excited by until I started to work on it. So two different kinds of user taxes that we looked at. One was electricity duties. Now, electricity duties are already charged by state governments. Almost all state governments charge it, except that they're minimal. Now, if all other fossil fuel revenues are going to go down and we are going to shift away from, let us say, fossil fuel-based energy to renewable energy, then you can actually increase electricity duties, at least conceptually. Now, remember, I said that state governments are generally not very keen on doing this. But the fact is, this is a solution of a very serious problem. Okay. The other one, which I have seen very little discussion of, but that's again a really interesting possibility, is what we call distance travel tax. With the new technologies that are available today, you can have a GPS identifier for every single vehicle, and using that, you can identify what every class of vehicle or what is the distance it traveled. And we can have different tax rates. For larger vehicles, you can have a higher tax rate. For a two-wheeler, you can have a lower tax rate. For a petrol vehicle, you can have a higher tax rate. For an EV, you can have a lower tax rate. So you can actually have all of this. So both of these are interesting possibilities. And when you check out the numbers, they can be huge, massive in scale. However, and there's always a however, our analysis found that the combination of increased electricity duties and distance-based taxes would have a high negative impact on economic activity. Now, to the order of almost a percentage of GDP. This is not surprising, since user taxes in general have a significant negative impact on economic activity and are often inequitable. That problem being said, it is something which can very easily be done, because under Article 248, a new form of tax, if imposed, can easily be imposed by the union government. State governments take care of electricity duties. You don't need to coordinate. You have different taxes, and you don't need to have some sort of a cooperative solution. Now I'm going to go towards the last part, and to me, as the environmentalist working on an economic problem, the more interesting set of solution, and that is carbon taxes. A frequently discussed solution is the imposition of carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are taxes that are levied on the basis of emissions, or rather carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Hence, if an economic activity emits more, that activity is charged more. So the problem here is that carbon taxes are inherently only for a few years. Once we stop using fossil fuels, you don't have any scope for this. But at least in the short term, there is an interesting solution that we have. It's not a long-term solution. Currently, India taxes both coal and petroleum differently. Coal is charged at GST at a 5%. Petroleum has a surfeit of taxes, both by the state governments as well as union governments, and they are highly dependent on petroleum taxes. Okay. So if I was to put up a carbon tax, now I have a problem, because there are already all of these taxes that are being imposed. So while a new carbon tax can be instituted under Article 248 by the union government, it will need to convince the states to stop taxing petroleum products. So essentially, it will need to reduce state autonomy. Extremely difficult exercise in the current scenario. It's almost as good as saying stop taxing liquor. It's not going to happen. Right? So that is a huge challenge that we will need to face. So when global powers, and this is a very popular sentiment globally of instituting carbon taxes, talk about carbon taxes, institutionally, it is almost an impossibility in India. However, and there is always a solution, carbon taxes may be more feasible if we consider carbon taxes as a top-up tax. That means let the carbon taxes be there, let whatever taxes are there, let them be there, and let's impose a carbon tax on top of it. Okay, easy enough to do, etc., except that it will become a very complex, messy affair. People will have to pay all kinds of multiple taxes, etc., but it's a possibility. Finally, what if we brought in GST and carbon taxes? Now, this seems very strange because GST is a value-added tax. Carbon tax is a tax on emissions. So it's something like saying, I'm going to take an orange, take an apple, and I'm going to create something by putting the apple into the orange, and somehow it needs to taste like both. It's not going to work. But I'm going to try and explain to you of how it just might. So I'm going to there are two possibilities of doing this. Consider the case where the charge is levied on a coal user for its emissions, okay, such as in a thermal plant. Okay? Since GST is an ad valorem tax, it is imposed on the output value. Carbon emissions can also be considered as a type of output, except they are not a good, they are a bad. Okay, so again, I'll just repeat. Suppose the case is where I want to levy a tax on a coal user, meaning a thermal power plant, right? Now, the thermal power plant, traditionally, I would have levied the tax only on the electricity generated, or the value of the electricity generated. But now I'm going to levy a tax on the electricity generated as well as the pollution generated. Right? Now, once I do that, I can actually come up with a number where I can somehow fuse these two together. I can talk a bit more in the detail, but I'm going to skip that part. But what it does mean is that there is a possibility. That possibility, however, will require some institutional mechanism. You will need to measure the level of emissions. You will need to identify how to translate X amount of emission into Y rupees as a tax. These are going to be extremely complex exercises, and I can imagine there will be a lot of, opposition to whatever this entity does. But you will need to create a new institution to be able to do that. There are other possibilities as well, which I'm going to skip, and now come towards the last part of my talk, which is, there are no easy solutions, as there rarely are in the game of policy making. Each solution we can think of has some challenges. It is the classic policy problem that India's political economic process will need to solve. We as economists, I feel, cannot solve this problem. It will be the political economics process which will need to solve it. But for us, what is important is the question, what is the best policy for India going forward? How do we inform this political economic process? What is the best route forward? Let me start via a process of elimination. So I'm going to start to eliminate some of the things which I've just spoken about. The way I see it, it would be great to identify a long-term solution. It is much more better to have a long-term solution than a stopgap 10, 20-year solution. Right? Therefore, continuity is important. However, right now we are living in the present. Is really continuity that important? Let me solve today's problem at least. So, while it would have been ideal to have a long-term solution, since I don't have solutions, I'm going to throw away that particular assumption of continuity. Okay. Second, direct benefit transfers have actually broadly succeeded. There are problems, of course, but they're broadly succeeding. So if DBTs are direct benefit transfers or direct cash transfers are succeeding, perhaps equity need not be a criterion. Why? Because as long as I can generate enough resources, I can find some way of compensating the loser. So equity is not also. So I can throw away equity as well. Okay. Third, this problem of political economic infeasibility. Okay. I am going to argue that that should not be a criterion. India's political economic process may leave a lot to be desired. It may also work very slowly, it may be unfair, it may be inefficient, but it has also delivered in many key aspects. It is for us to identify various alternatives and their pros and cons and inform the political economic process to take forward. It is not for us to decide, it is for that process to decide. So I find that depending upon our priorities, there are three workable options. So I've thrown away these assumptions that I had. So if economic growth and efficiency is the key criterion, if that is most important to us, then the most preferred solution would be a general enhancement of GST. Okay, and I had started by saying that Dr. Chelliah's work still informs us. It actually does. When we do our quantitative analysis on this, we find that a general improvement in GST is perhaps the best way. You will, of course, need to expand the coverage. We'll need to perhaps expand the rate, simplify it, etc., etc. But that's one way forward for us. Of course, we do recognize the center-state issues, interstate, the consensus, the delays, etc. That we recognize. Second, if speed of rollout and circumventing the need for center-state coordination is your priority number one, okay, then the best thing to do is to have electricity for states, distance for the center, and forget about everything else. Alternatively, you can also think of a top-up tax, top-up carbon tax. Both of those don't require the center and the states and everyone to come to any sort of an agreement. Third, if reducing emissions and increasing the pace of transition as an environmentalist, that's closest to my heart, is the key criteria, then clearly a carbon tax of some type is most desirable. As I have discussed earlier, there are many ways by which some form of a carbon tax can be instituted. However, any mechanism that can fuse carbon tax with the GST may perhaps be the best way forward. Before ending, I would like to again recap three things which I had mentioned and not stressed upon, but I would like to stress upon those. There are some issues that, at the risk of repetition, I would identify as the key enabling factors or necessary conditions, whichever options we choose. First, due to a combination of factors, including poor DISCOM management and regulation, most DISCOMs or electricity power distribution companies have locked massive amounts of debt. Not only does this debt need to be eliminated, but conditions need to be created such that cost plus pricing is done in a better manner. If we do not address this problem, not only would energy transition be impossible to achieve, but India's ambitions of improved Fisc and, of course, growth will also fail. Second, the union-state relation is a very intimate relationship. You need to develop it, and it needs to continually, you need to work at it. This has to be one of mutual respect and individual responsibility. This cannot happen if state governments do not take responsibility for their own revenues. And this cannot happen if the union government overuses cesses and charges. Third, whatever path is eventually chosen by the political economic process, we must strengthen the mechanisms and institutions that will be required to implement these changes. The success of tax options before us will be determined by the institutions we create and sustain. And finally, it is time now for the policy process to embrace environmental objectives, just as it embraced growth and equity in the past. For that to be possible, it is our responsibility as economists and policy professionals to identify the right alternatives and inform this to the political economic process. I think Dr. Chelliah would agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us with this thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure it's going to open up a lot of debate, and therefore the floor is now open for questions and answers.
A wonderful speech, sir. Really enjoyed all of the sort of alternatives you've provided. Because you've touched upon a very important quotient which is the political economic process. Every single party in any country is funded by companies for them to run their campaigns, for them to rally, for them to just go about their day-to-day activities. So there seems to be a trade-off of sorts, even if environmental goals are espoused. If environmental goals are espoused, the companies that fund these parties essentially aren't as sanctimonious or aren't as environmentally cautious as they ought to be. So, but yet they're still the lifeblood of the parties in power or in opposition or whatever. So this seems to be a structural problem, wherein you espouse something, but the very thing that's funding you lies in stark contrast to your own principles. So at a larger level, how do you propose to solve this?
So I don't propose to solve this. It will solve by itself. And you're absolutely right. We can all be very cynical, and there's enough to go by. But when I was in college, I was very cynical. How can this happen? How will this happen? How can India ever achieve high growth? How can it ever earn export revenues? I remember seeing papers by people, very established researchers and academics, telling us how this was not possible, that was not possible. You have it. The political economic process is not, as I've mentioned, it's not linear, but it does deliver sometimes. So you just have to work towards it so that, and I feel that our responsibility as economists is to at least deliver the options and alternatives and the outcomes that each of those has for this process to take over. Let me just give you one more example. There are many countries, democratic countries, that have been funded by funds from companies to political parties. Scandinavian countries, even other countries in Latin America, in Asia, but you still find that governments do take these kind of measures. So don't be so cynical.
Thank you. I'm just wondering about most of the India still is covered with the local corruption, and we are kind of jumping and wanting to solve the climate problem or the carbon emissions problem. So should it not be sequential? To what extent we are actually succeeding in our local environmental problem and management of that? And why aren't we discussing that? That's first question. Not you, in general. The second is, in the entire discussion on the climate, we have nowhere, I didn't hear you at least today speaking, the right amount of the tax that should be levied to address the fundamental issue under consideration and climate. The social cost of carbon is nowhere being talked about in any of these carbon tax related discussions. Without it, are we actually environmentally effective? Just doing something to eyewash ourselves and be good factor that we are doing something. I just want to do it.
So first, on the social cost of carbon, people have attempted coming up with some numbers, and the problem is that it is so dependent on so many assumptions that it becomes extremely difficult to come up with a robust number. But there are some standard numbers that are given that for low-income countries go around $25, for higher income $35 and $50 and $75. So there are these things that someone in IMF estimated. So we use that. The reason why you're not seeing more is because actually the movement hasn't happened towards taxing carbon in the and we're finding problems there. Once we start to see momentum there, you would start to see far more people taking the farms. Now, the question, I think the far deeper question on do you spend your limited resources on reducing emissions or do you on adaptation or improving resilience? That's a really important problem that many people are worried about. But there are some spaces where both happen. coal power plants or thermal power plants is one space. Where you do know that today, for instance, in North India, it's not just rock burning. Thermal power plants are a very major cause of the winter pollution. Now there is a problem. You do need those thermal power plants because evening power you can't get from solar. Right? So you do need them, but there is a problem. Now if you can address that, then you can actually get two wins with one action. Right? And there are some solutions that people are looking at that. So those definitely we need to work on much more than we have. Finally, how do you divide up? Actually, for adaptation, you don't need that much resources. You just need a lot of action, regulatory action. You need a lot of not as much investments in capital as well investments in people and institutions. We can have a later conversation on that later if you need. But the major investments required would be that for emissions. That's
Thank you for your enlightening speech, Dr. Bhandari. I have two questions, and since I have two, I'll keep them very short. My first is regarding, you mentioned that the revenue changes in revenue are heterogeneous, both across space and in terms of the different levels of the federal government. Now, my question is, considering that, you still feel that direct benefit transfers, no matter how good we get in terms of implementation, being a blunt instrument, are they still enough to create equity or maintain the current level of equity for that matter? My second question is regarding your the two attacks you mentioned, one on emissions and the other on outputs petroleum. Now, what I feel is that while those two numbers are important, I feel like the more important number is the ratio between the two. How much are you able to generate while keeping a low level of emissions? I think that number is more important when you're thinking about accessibility. Is this that on the right path to, because you didn't get a chance to expound on that, so I wonder if you think that's the right path. Thanks.
I didn't take that path for the reason because that would lead to many more questions that one needs to ask. And I will just throw those questions at you. Given the way the other parts of the world are behaving, okay, should you even bother with trying to limit? So the sensible, rational person would say, don't. Do a tit for tat. If you don't behave, I will not behave. And I will focus on adaptation. But is that the hallmark of a responsible society? That's the question. I'm not answering it. It's an internal thing, as I said. So the way forward is based on individual responsibility and mutual respect. Right? What are you willing to take responsibility for? And I completely agree with you. If you said that I don't want to take responsibility for this, then yes, it is true that in 10 years, India would be probably the most polluting or most emitting country in the world. Yeah, and it's fine. It would be the rational thing to have that. Right? Second, this part of why don't we just ensure some minimal amount of emissions and then go for growth, right? In a sense, that is what the stated thing for the government is, or was, until it started to put up more thermal power plants, which have started to come. And they have a problem, and I don't deny that problem. The problem is, how do you supply energy or electricity in the evening if you don't have more thermal power? Because batteries and storage is extremely expensive. Now, this is a problem. No two things about it. Unfortunately, we can't have a longer discussion on that. But this is a real problem, and I completely understand that issue. You will need to find some solution to that. Finally, what I'm saying here is not that you please do whatever you are trying to do so that transition can happen better. I'm saying, given what the government has committed, you are going to get less revenues. So if you want to save your revenue, then you need to do something. Okay. So even if we said, okay, fine, we don't care about the environment, we don't want to be responsible for it, right? You at least need to be responsible for your own revenues. Now the question is, how are you going to get those revenues? That is essentially. Now, if you're going to get those revenues, just see on the side, will the environment be served? If it will be, why not? If it will not be, okay, fine, do a GST.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful perspectives and figures. My question is related to private property rights. Professor Chelliah and you Shankar, few others referred to it with respect to provisions, environment, energy related. But when it comes to private property, because one of the fundamental rights of our constitution, but later unfortunately was removed actually. Because the private property, whether it's a government or individual person or a state or even any government corporate entity, have a clear boundary to not to pollute the defined land or whatever the services also. But when we look any debate in environmentalism in India, it seems to be that this private property as perspective has been missing quite a long. Many other countries may be succeeded, some of them actually.
Thank you. I actually don't understand that question very well because the way I see it, things like, let's say, thermal power emissions, or for that matter, effluent flows from industries, right? They are not very localized. They cannot be limited to within a certain private property boundary. They tend to be more regional in nature. They will spread over larger areas. So you won't need the state to be involved in it. Just by allocating property rights may not be possible.
Good evening, sir, and thank you for your enlightening speech. So, you had earlier mentioned that the state and central governments are, reluctant to implement the price solutions like cesses and taxes. But what my argument is, why don't we increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our non-price solutions? Like, for example, one solution which I propose is like the decentralization of electricity production and generation. Like bringing MSMEs into the picture and making them generate electricity and distribute it at a much decentralized level and at a much local level rather than a state distribution company taking charge of the whole process. So what would you like?
Yes, so economies of scale work against localized production. However, there is a government policy on rooftop solar, which is highly disaggregated production, right? Well, it's first of all, it's extremely expensive, such low level. Second, you require far more infrastructure related investments than a single source. Till now, the technologies that what we have, localized production tends to be very difficult.
Hi, sir. Thank you for your lecture. I have a small question regarding there's already an ongoing debate, such as the areas happening like Europe, but then serving like Nigeria or something. So, your solution about generally expanding GST, how feasible and implementable is that? That's a big question.
As I mentioned, it's going to be difficult. Okay. But going forward, when you don't have revenues, you'll be forced to come to the talking table. That's the issue. So our job right now is to just say this is an option before you. It is going to be difficult. It's going to be very difficult to get so many states to align on this for the states in the union. Given the fact that GST hasn't delivered in terms of revenue quantum as much as some thought.
Okay, so thank you all. I think this is the last question we could have taken. Now, I request Dr. C. Rangarajan to deliver the President's remark.
Dr. Bhandari, Mrs. Chelliah and Malika, they have just gone out. Mr. Shankar and distinguished participants. We have just listened to a very inspiring Raja Chelliah memorial lecture. Raja Chelliah was an eminent economist, one who specialized in the area of public finance. And many of his ideas found place in the reforms that were initiated in the early 1990s. We are thankful to Raja Chelliah's family and the Southern Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry for supporting this endowment lecture. They have been doing it from year after year. And I'm once again grateful to you and others. We are also extremely thankful to Laveesh Bhandari for delivering this lecture. As he mentioned, we have known each other for a long period, even though in between we lost contacts. But when people talk about climate change, pollution and all that, the focus is always on how to transit from the present situation to that situation. That is important. I mean, I think that is critical. But what Dr. Bhandari talked to us today is to go beyond that. Namely, that if that transition is to occur, then we ought to face the situation that it will result in the loss of revenue to the government. And therefore, unless we also think about and think through the problems relating to the financing of that, then the goal itself may not be easy to achieve. And he went into various issues connected with raising the funds. Therefore, besides being an economist of very great eminence, Mr. Bhandari is also a public policy analyst. The public policy analyst is something more than an economist, and I think one needs domain knowledge. That is critical. But with domain knowledge, you also need to know what policies will work, and if policies are to work, what kind of changes or arrangements in the system have to be introduced is also critically important. We talk towards the end, the institutional changes that are required if we have to fulfill some of the issues that will arise. So I'm deeply grateful to you, Bhandari, for coming, accepting our invitation, being with us, and delivering a lecture which I think will make people think about many issues in policy and implementation. I am not an energy expert, and I have done many things in economics, but I won't classify myself as an energy expert. But every economist knows that the energy issues cannot be ignored, and I think this is critical. That is partly because of the fact that in meeting the energy requirements of the country, we are not self-sufficient. I look at the balance of payments problems and the balance of payment statements very frequently, and it is very clear that 30% of our imports are oil, and the POL as we call it, and therefore it becomes a critical issue, because when many people talk about what is called energy safety, I mean, I think we need this energy. As of now, we can get it only through imports, and therefore we place ourselves into a difficult situation. I will talk of two situations. One was in 1990. Very simply, the balance of payment situation in India was already critical. Then came the Iraq-Kuwait war. And suddenly, as you know, the price of oil doubled at that time. And I also recall at that time, because I had to handle it, and from something like 2.8 or something like that, $1 billion, we went up, it went up $3.8 billion to $6 billion, that is 1991. And that altered the entire situation. What we call the crisis of 1991 was just this. We didn't have enough resources to meet the increase in the total bill. Our payments were higher than what we can receive, and then it led to a lot of many other issues and so on and so forth. And I remember the day when we were calculating the time and when we used to calculate what our reserves were, and we finally touched a point in which our reserves were equivalent only to 3 weeks of imports. Today, our reserves are equivalent to 8 months of imports. And when we got to that situation, I think the urgency became very clear, and we need to act in many ways, which we did, which is unusual, shipping gold, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that the energy security has become a critical important. Now look at the more recent phenomenon, the Russia-Ukraine war. When the war broke out, then the supply chains were cut, supply routes were cut, and once again the same thing happened. The price of oil went up, the price of crude oil went up. Therefore, in one sense, apart from the issues of pollution and climate change problems will cause, even from a purely balance of payments point of view, that we need to contain this import of oil and move our energy requirements or energy needs from oil to something else. Therefore, that is the starting point in some way. And the other things were added to it. And therefore, in a sense, what we are really going through is a transition which we desire, that we move away from fossil fuel to renewable energy sources like nuclear and solar, wind, and many other things. But I believe that, on the numbers that I have seen, the transition is not moving that fast. I mean, other experts may come in, but I don't see it that moving that fast. I think the transition is occurring, and people are now conscious of what has to be done. But I think the movement is still somewhat slow, but we need to quicken it because the urgency is from the point of view of what will happen to human life at large and human life in our own country, and that is what we have to do. In a sense, what has happened is, from a purely balance of payments problem, if we had a discovery, another discovery like Bombay High, we could solve it. But that is, I mean, that's one side. But our imports of oil continue to remain at 30% because after Bombay High, there has been no major discovery. And that's a different kind of problem. If you want to solve the balance of payments problem, you can solve the problem by actually aggravating the crisis in some other sense. Because if we start producing more oil and crude oil, that is not going to solve the problem of how to live peacefully in this world. Therefore, that is a different thing. So the point really is there is need for a sense of urgency in really making the transition. Because Dr. Bhandari went to the second step. If we really make the transition, what will we do? But I think the transition itself is taking time, and we really need to do it fast. But then we cannot ignore that problem. As he said, that if we do not know how to raise the revenue, how to do it, perhaps we may even abandon the original objective. Then he did talk about some of the questions relating to taxation and other things. As he put it, right now, the taxation on petroleum products and others is at a very high level. In fact, even coal, all of that. In fact, if you look at the state government's budgets, the main sources of tax revenue are three. One, liquor. I think that's a very severe problem. I think there's a conflict of objectives there. But liquor is the main thing. Then comes tobacco. Then comes the petroleum products. Therefore, all of these, particularly petroleum products income, revenue, will go down as it happens. And also we also showed how coal also bears a lot of taxation and how the reduction in the use of coal can affect the revenue. When you talk about taxation, there are two types of taxation. When you talk about carbon tax or tax on emissions, we are essentially talking of taxes which have a dual objective, to reduce revenue, but the other thing is to reduce emission and so on and so forth. That is different from tax system, where we deal with GST in general, or we deal with income tax, or we deal with it. That is for the purpose of raising the revenue. And I personally think that much will not happen unless we do something about direct taxes. I think the direct taxes will have to be touched if we really want to increase the revenue. We also teach in economics the ratio of direct taxes to the indirect taxes must increase, because I think it is always considered we can apply equity principles in the case of direct taxes, but it is much more difficult in the case of indirect taxes. Therefore, I would really think that if we want to raise a revenue, we must do something about the direct taxes also. I think you indicated that, for example, which was Chelliah was also saying, widen the base and reduce the rate. But we are sometimes not even widening the base, as it has happened in the recent budget. Therefore, we must really widen the base and reduce the rate. In the direct taxation, I want to make 2 points. One, there was a time when we experimented with expenditure tax, long time ago. T.T. Krishnamachari was the finance minister. Now, we abandoned it. The question that arose at that particular time was, do you have an income tax and expenditure tax? Or do you have only one expenditure tax alone? Now, there is a lot of literature on expenditure tax and the respective importance of income tax and expenditure tax. Because how do you estimate expenditure? The only way to estimate expenditure is you take the income tax or the income and subtract the savings, and that is treated as expenditure. And that is what, therefore, you do not get away from all the complexities in income tax. That is a starting point. Look at the savings, subtract, and that is the expenditure, and levy a tax. I do not know whether you want to experiment again with expenditure tax. But if you are driven to a situation in which you will have to raise revenue, and raise revenue of a substantial nature, I think a re-look at expenditure tax will also become important. Second, I had written somewhere, but not elaborated very much. Should we have a state income tax? There are countries which have state income tax. The United States is one good example. In fact, they have even a local government levying a tax. This will give the autonomy to the states and so on. But there is a problem. The problem is that will this all end up in very heavy taxation? While this is an issue, actually it doesn't happen, because in levying the state income tax, you don't go through a very elaborate process. All of us who have filed income tax in the United States at one time will know you arrive at what is your income for the federal government, as they call it. Then a percentage is taken of it. A percentage of it is taken it as the state income tax. The state income tax people do not look at the income statement and all that. I mean, they just take what you have filed for the federal government and then apply in addition to it. But if you look at the United States, you find that many state governments do not levy an income tax. Because they are saying, because of their feeling it is competitive, and some other, the state which levies a high income tax will not get the investment, and therefore, I don't exactly remember the number of states, but fairly large number of states do not levy income tax. But in India, we will have to see whether we can, this will also, of course, require a constitutional amendment, and this will also require what limits that you put on the state governments and so on. But since state governments are very concerned about the fact that their autonomy is going down and they do not have sources of revenue, this is something also one can look at. There is one other suggestion, which is not exactly a direct tax, but a combination. That is, when you need revenue, you know there are some people in this country who argue remove income tax. What do they say then? You remove income tax, what do you remove for the revenue? The answer to that is you levy a tax on every financial transaction. I have opposed it. I said this will, at a time when we are wanting the financial system to develop, this is a wrong thing. But at one particular point, you might want to do it. But that is a situation in which it started with what is called the Tobin tax. The Tobin tax was a levy of a tax on all international financial transactions. I mean, that is it. When the financial transactions, if you levy, you will get a huge amount as a consequence. You'll have to keep it at a very, very low level. But that really means that every transaction that you do, if you go and draw a check, if you draw money from the bank, it will be treated as a financial transaction, the tax will be levied. But I'm only raising it to say that there are people who have these ideas also. And there is some amount of literature on this financial transaction tax, because the Tobin tax also did not find much favor and nobody implemented it. So when it comes to it, I believe that if you want to raise revenue, let us not completely do away with income tax and things like that. We should really look at it. In the GST, the whole issue is that it has become complicated because of too many slabs and so on and so forth. Therefore, they are saying the simple tax, as they call it, GST. Now, if you want to make it as a simple tax, you must reduce the slabs. I don't think that you need to combine carbon tax with GST. I think carbon tax can be levied separately, that's all. And GST can continue as it is. That is, after all, even today, I was talking to Dr. Bhanumurthy a little while earlier, that the state governments talk a great deal about GST, but the bulk of the revenue of the state governments come from excise duties which are outside GST. I mean, I think petroleum, tobacco, and liquor. So they are collected. Therefore, carbon tax can be collected separately. And the GST may stand as it is. So I just listened to you and I thought, and I would think that the carbon tax like pollution tax, had a different objective, namely to reduce the carbon thing. So if you really want to widen the tax base, that is one way of doing it. So, in fact, the real problem with GST is that many people, they calculated the revenue neutral rate. And the rate that is now being levied is not equal to the revenue neutral rate. That is the weighted average of the GST tax is not equal to the revenue neutral rate. In fact, I mean, there are many people who have estimated, including myself, on the revenue neutral rate, and that is not fully implemented now. And therefore, if you really want to get the right kind of revenue, you should move to that, the revenue neutral rate. After all, revenue neutral rate essentially implies that you are going back to a situation where all those taxes before introduction gave you some revenue, at least that revenue should be collected. So we should really look at GST from that particular angle. Anyway, I think the world is changing fast. We have people now coming around and saying that there is no problem called climate change, and they occupy very important positions. And we do not know President Trump what he will do tomorrow. I mean, I think every day you will have to wait and see what he does. Therefore, the whole issue is that the problem of what we do, if United States, the biggest country in the world in terms of the power, in terms of the economic power, opts out of this. And already he has said that he is away from Paris settlement. Therefore, because the climate change that happens is, so to say, indivisible in the sense that you cannot have it for one country and cannot have it for another country. Because if United States continues to consume fossil fuel at a rapid rate, then all of us will suffer. So there is a real problem there. But I do hope good sense will prevail sometime. And we will have to convince people that this is not the route to take. So towards the end, Dr. Bhandari also talked about many things that we may need to do in order to be able to achieve our objective. I think we need to take care of them. But if it is a purely national problem, it is easy to handle. But it is no longer a national problem. It is a global problem. And unless there is global consent, we may not be able to make much, may not be able to move forward. So we will have to wait and see. And at this particular moment, I am somewhat discouraged and disappointed in the way in which the world is moving, and well-known scientific conclusions are being thrown to the wind, saying that there is no problem relating to climate change. I will once again thank Bhandari for a stimulating lecture, a thought-provoking lecture, and I'm sure that all of you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now it's time for the vote of thanks, which I request Mr. T.G. Suresh, Chair, Direct Taxation Committee, SICI, to deliver. Thank you, sir.
So, Mr. Laveesh Bhandari, so Mr. Sri Rangarajan, Mr. Pranamurthy, Mr. Sri Shankar. It was indeed a very big honor. In fact, day before yesterday, I was in my 41st year of my income tax. That's my 41st year. On 18th March 1985, FS took the income tax subject. But I was asked for whether you will be willing to deliver the vote of thanks, and I asked what programs are about. It's about Chelliah Memorial Lecture. I can't even say no, because as an income tax student, when we talk about tax reforms, we always remember of them. I don't know how many of you know tax. Some of these simplified tax like presumptive taxations are all the brainchild of this great gentleman. So the moment I got the opportunity, it's a great honor for me. I just want to really take it up. So as far as Bhandari's speech is concerned, sir, it's quite amazing the way in which you are trying to talk about the problems, the opportunities, the kind of the share of tax, and a combination of consumption tax, come the pollution tax, whatever you want to call. Quite amazing, sir. I think you've just lived up, and at a time of 3:30. So even though the weather outside is very warm, because we have all seen the climate change, the month of February, Chennai was unusually very cool. And in Meerut in the first week, it was unusually very hot. And of course, only Trump can say there is no climate change. Thank you, sir. It was quite extraordinary. Amidst your pressing commitments, come here all the way, delivered. It's quite, we all enjoyed it. Thank you, sir. So one of the greatest economists of our country, sir, you may not be an energy expert, but your sheer presence here brings energy to the entire audience. And I'm also thankful to you because, unlike Bhandari, so you wanted to expand my profession, even at the fair end of, even though I'm slightly at the last, I would call it as last 20 years of profession, not fag end. But you said the direct tax revenue should still go up. So, I mean, that gives us an opportunity first. Thank you, sir. I think the transaction tax, in fact, I was thinking for a moment if we get an opportunity to see whether we can consider that also. Given the fact today, I don't think anyone of them, in fact, I don't have a purse today, just I forgot. That's one reason. But even otherwise, I don't have any cash there because we use a mobile. I think it's the most appropriate time to really explore the possibility of transaction tax because definitely India's progress exceptional. Even when you go to anywhere, not only in Chennai, Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, everywhere, even for buying a flower to anything, you can use your UPI mobile. I think it's the right time to consider that wonderful option. So always, Director Sir, so thank you for all your support. It's always been, all these lectures were possible because of your support. Fisc, of course, has always been part of any of these ventures. So any programs or any of these things are always meant only for audiences. You are such a wonderful audience. And there are some amazing questions were also in the process. And of course, one of them was quite interesting. Tax like Europe, lifestyle like Nigeria. I don't know whether you visited Nigeria. But anyhow, how that is possible unless we are going to pay tax promptly? Look at the number we have. In a country of 140 crores population, what is our tax rebate? So I think that is something, whether it's a climate change or anything, I think what all of us should understand, it is our collective responsibility for anything, whether it is a transition towards a zero emission or anything, unless all of us are going to pay tax. I'll just tell you, the moment the transaction tax proposed by Rangan is implemented, most of the people will start thinking about, can we go back to extend the transaction by way of cash? Now, this is our thinking. I think we have to get out of this particular thinking. Unless we think, paying tax, I think all of us should reach our pride. And we all start paying tax properly. Even today, just take the case of real estate transactions. Even today, there's still a lot of cash transactions despite demonetization, everything still is happening. So, unless all of us start paying tax, if we do it properly, I'm sure we will not only paying that, and we will by 2047, we will surely become a Viksit Bharat. Maybe I don't know whether I will be allowed to see that, but I'm sure the one who would express it, you will definitely see this wonderful India. And I will be feeling my duty if I don't thank the special invitees and of course the media and all of you present here. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you. Enjoy the evening. Thanks.
Thank you so much. With this, I'm afraid we are coming to an end. Before we leave, we have to rise for the national anthem.